where history wakes with the sun.
All life begins in the soil.
The fields feed every kingdom. If you think medieval peasants lived in endless misery, think again. The image of the bent-backed, mud-covered farmer toiling under the Lord's command is only one side of the story, and not always the truest one. Peasants were not just labourers. They were the living engine of the Middle Ages, powering kingdoms, churches, and even the rise of cities. Without their fields, no castle could stand, no army could march, and no cathedral could rise into the sky. Today we're stepping into their world not as distant observers, but as guests walking between furrowed rows of earth that fed a civilization. Picture a village before the sun lifts over the horizon. The smell of wood smoke drifts from low, thatched cottages. Somewhere a rooster crows its voice cutting through the mist that clings to the hedgerows. Men, women and children stir awake, for farming was a family affair and every pair of hands mattered. Beyond the fields, you might glimpse the Lord's manor or the spire of the village church, reminders that the land was more than just soil. It was the thread binding together every life from the lowest tenant to the highest noble. Medieval farming wasn't simply about survival. It was about rhythm, the steady turning of the seasons. Each month brought its own duties and dangers, from sowing seeds in the damp chill of spring to gathering the harvest under the watchful eye of the summer sun. Fail to follow nature's schedule and the consequences could be severe. A poor yield, an empty granary, perhaps even famine. But master that rhythm and the rewards were more than food, they were stability trade and the foundation for the village's future. What may surprise you is how much knowledge medieval peasants possessed. Far from ignorant, they understood soil types, crop rotations and weather patterns in ways that modern meteorologists might admire. They bred hardy strains of wheat, rye and barley that could survive harsh winters. They knew how to preserve food to last the hungry months and how to coax life from the ground without exhausting it. In their hands, the plough wasn't just a tool, it was a key unlocking wealth from the earth. Of course, their lives were not free from hardship. Taxes, tithes, and labour obligations to the Lord or the Church could be crushing. Disease and unpredictable weather could undo months of labour overnight. Yet within these constraints, peasants built communities that endured for generations. They held festivals to mark the end of harvest, shared tools with neighbours, and passed down songs and stories that kept spirits alive during long winters. It was this mix of struggle and solidarity that defined rural life in the Middle Ages. As we walk through the story of medieval peasants and their fields, we'll explore not just the work they did, but the systems that depended on them. We'll see how their labour underpinned the feudal order, how their innovations shaped the medieval economy, and how their resilience carried Europe through centuries of war, plague and change. We'll follow the farming year from the first breaking of spring soil to the last sheaf gathered in autumn. And along the way we'll discover that behind every stone wall and cobbled street of the medieval world lay a field and a farmer who made it possible. So take a step off the paved roads of history and onto the narrow muddy lanes that lead between hedgerows and open fields. Look around and you'll see the beating heart of the Middle Ages, not in the grandeur of kings and knights, but in the quiet persistence of the people who worked the land. Their story is one of grit and grace, of the endless turning of the seasons, and of the simple truth that civilization begins with the soil beneath our feet. This is the story of the medieval fields and the secrets they still hold.
The heart of the medieval world.
Step into a medieval village and the first thing you might notice is its size, small, compact, and built for function rather than grandeur. Most villages housed only a few dozen families, their homes clustered around a central green or along a single dirt lane. The layout wasn't accidental, it was shaped by necessity, with houses close enough for mutual aid and far enough to allow access to the surrounding fields. A well often shared by the whole community stood at the centre, while the church, modest or imposing, depending on the wealth of the manor, loomed as both a spiritual and social hub. From the edge of the village, the patchwork of fields stretched outward, bounded by hedgerows, low stone walls, or simple wooden fences. The homes themselves were humble yet ingeniously adapted to the realities of rural life. Most were single-room structures built from what the land provided: timber, from nearby woods, wattle, and daub walls made of woven branches coated in clay and straw, and roofs of thatch harvested from reeds or long grasses. Floors were often packed earth, though wealthier peasants might have wooden planks. Inside there was no grand separation of spaces. One area served for cooking, eating and sleeping with livestock, sometimes brought indoors during the coldest months to share warmth. Furniture was sparse and functional, a heavy wooden table, a few benches, chests for storage, and perhaps a bed frame for the head of the household. Everything else was built to be repaired easily using the same materials as the house itself. Light and heat came from the hearth, the true centre of the medieval home. Usually placed in the middle or against one wall, it was both stove and furnace, casting a dim orange glow over the interior. Chimneys were rare in early medieval times. Instead, smoke seeped out through the thatch or a hole in the roof, leaving rafters darkened with soot. The hearth's fire never went out if it could be helped. Rekindling it from scratch was tedious, and its warmth was life-saving in winter. Pots hung over the flames, simmering stews made from vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat. In the evenings, the family gathered here not just to eat, but to talk men tools and spin wool by the flicker of the firelight. A village wasn't just a random collection of houses. It was an interwoven network of workspaces, paths, and shared facilities. Barns and sheds dotted the edges, storing tools, grain, and hay. Small gardens, sometimes fenced with woven willow, provided herbs, onions, leeks, and cabbages for daily meals. Communal ovens built of clay or stone served multiple families who took turns baking their bread. Blacksmiths, if the village had one, worked from a small forge, crafting nails, hinges, and repairing ploughs. In many cases, these functional buildings stood alongside the homes, blurring the lines between domestic and communal life. The placement of a village was never random. Access to water was essential, whether from a river, a spring, or a deep-dug well. The land itself had to be arable with good soil for crops and open pasture for livestock. Proximity to woodland meant fuel and building material, while nearby roads or paths connected the village to markets in neighbouring towns. Many villages lay under the shadow of a manor house or small castle where the local lord lived. Others were under the patronage of a monastery, which might own both the land and the labour of its tenants. The physical closeness of the villagers to their fields meant that a farmer could walk from his doorstep to his plough in minutes, saving time and effort. Yet life in these villages was not isolated. Market days and seasonal fairs brought traders, travellers, and news from beyond the hedgerows. Villagers knew each other's lives intimately. Weddings, births, and funerals were community events. Disputes over land boundaries or livestock were settled in the manor court, often in the open air. Children ran freely through the lanes, learning chores by watching their elders. Even the architecture reflected this sense of shared life. Homes were positioned to face one another, creating a physical space where conversation and cooperation were constant. If you were to stand in the middle of a medieval village, you'd see more than just simple dwellings. You'd see a carefully balanced system, where every home, path, and building served a purpose, shaped by centuries of adaptation to the land. These were places where survival depended on collaboration, where the boundary between private and communal was almost invisible. Each cottage was a small world, yet part of a larger whole, a living, breathing network that sustained itself through the seasons. And though centuries have passed, the traces of these villages still linger in the landscape's sunken lanes, scattered stones, and the faint outlines of the fields they once fed.
From dawn till dusk, life flows.
The day in a medieval peasant's life began not with an alarm clock, but with the first pale light of dawn. In the quiet hours before sunrise, the village stirred to life. Roosters crowed, dogs barked, and the smell of smoke began to curl from cottage roofs. Inside, the family gathered near the hearth, breaking their fast with coarse bread porridge, or perhaps some leftover stew from the night before. Meals were quick and simple. The fields waited for no one. Even children had tasks to do before the adults set out, fetching water from the well, gathering firewood, or feeding the chickens and pigs. Once the morning chores at home were complete, the bulk of the day unfolded outdoors. In spring, men and older boys took to the fields to plough and sow seeds, guiding heavy wooden ploughs pulled by oxen or horses. Women often joined them, scattering seed, pulling weeds, or tending vegetable plots closer to home. Summer brought longer hours under the sun, cutting hay for winter fodder, or reaping ripened grain with curved sickles. These were physically demanding jobs, and the work rhythm was shaped by the land's needs, not by a fixed schedule. In a good year, every hour of daylight counted. In a bad year, every hour was a desperate effort to save what could be saved. Tasks shifted with the seasons, and so did the pace of life. In autumn, the focus turned to the harvest-binding sheaves of wheat, rye, or barley, threshing to separate grain from chaff, and storing it safely in barns or granaries. This was a time of both relief and exhaustion when months of labour finally bore fruit. Winter, by contrast, was slower but not idle. Repairs to tools and buildings, spinning and weaving and tending to livestock filled the days. Men might mend fences or clear drainage ditches, while women prepared preserved foods, mended clothing and brewed ale. Even in the quiet season there was always work to be done. The medieval day was punctuated by more than just meals and labour. The church bell marked the hours. Prime terce sext, none these were not just prayers, but time signals shaping the rhythm of village life. Many peasants worked under the watch of the manor's reeve or steward who ensured obligations to the lord were met. This might include specific days when they worked the lord's land rather than their own, or delivered portions of their harvest as rent. Balancing these duties with the needs of their own families required careful planning and sometimes quiet negotiation with neighbours. Life in the fields was not without camaraderie. Labour was often done in groups, and conversation flowed freely as hands worked. Songs, chants, and even jokes lightened the burden of repetitive tasks. In harvest time especially, the community worked side by side, helping each household bring in crops before the weather could turn. This cooperation wasn't just neighbourly kindness, it was survival. A failed harvest in one family could strain the whole village's winter reserves. Meals were woven into the day like rest stops along a long road. A small breakfast at dawn was followed by a mid-morning snack, perhaps cheese bread and ale eaten in the fields. The main meal came at midday, often a thick stew of beans, peas, or lentils enriched with whatever vegetables or scraps of meat were available. In the evenings after the tools were cleaned and stored, families gathered again around the hearth. Supper was lighter than lunch, but more social, a time to talk about the day's events planned for tomorrow and share stories. Beyond work, peasants' daily routines were shaped by the season's festivals and the church calendar. Feast days provided rare breaks from the grind, a chance to rest, eat better food, and enjoy music or games. The year's milestones, from planting to harvest, were often tied to saints' days or religious celebrations. Evenings might bring small gatherings at the alehouse or in neighbours' homes, especially in winter when darkness fell early. These moments were as important as labour binding the community together through shared traditions. Children's days were a blend of chores, learning and play. Young ones might herd geese, scare birds from crops or fetch water, while older children took on heavier tasks alongside their parents. Education was mostly practical learning. By doing, though, in some villages the parish priest might teach basic prayers and letters. Play came in snatches games with sticks and stones, chasing hoops, or mock battles with wooden swords. Through these small diversions, children absorbed the skills and values they would need as adults. Even the end of the day followed its own ritual. As dusk settled, animals were brought in from pasture tools stored away, and fires banked to keep the embers glowing through the night. Lamps and candles were scarce and costly, so most activity ended soon after sunset. Families gathered close in the dim light, perhaps sharing a final mug of ale or warm broth. Prayers were said, and beds, often shared by several family members, were prepared with straw or simple mattresses. The village quieted, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the wind in the thatch. The routine may seem repetitive to modern eyes, but to medieval peasants it was the framework of life. Each season brought its own blend of duties, joys, and hardships, and every task had its place in the survival of the community. There was satisfaction in a well-ploughed field, a full barn, or a warm hearth at day's end. And while the hours were long and the work demanding these rhythms created a sense of order in a world where nature and necessity ruled. The medieval peasant's day was not just a cycle of labour, it was the heartbeat of the village itself, steady and enduring through the centuries.
The seasons turn. Life follows.
Spring in the medieval countryside was more than just a change of season. It was a turning point in the year's survival. The long, dark months of winter had drained food stores, and the first green shoots in the fields carried the promise of renewal. As the days lengthened and the ground thawed, peasants emerged from their cottages ready to work the soil once more. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth, the call of migrating birds, and the muffled thud of hoes breaking ground. Hope was as tangible as the seeds they carried in sacks over their shoulders. Every furrow carved into the land was an investment in the months to come. The first task was preparing the fields, which had often lain fallow or snow-covered through winter. Men and women alike took to the land with ploughs, harrows and rakes, breaking up clods and clearing weeds. In many villages, this work was shared among neighbours, especially for large strips of common land. Oxen, patient and powerful, pulled heavy wooden ploughs tipped with iron, guided by a steady hand. The soil had to be turned at just the right depth to cradle the seeds while keeping moisture locked in. Too early and frost might still claim the crop. Too late and the growing season would be cut short. Sowing itself was a skill that looked deceptively simple. Seed was scattered by hand in long, sweeping gestures, a rhythm perfected over years of practice. The goal was even coverage too dense and plants would choke each other, too sparse and weeds would claim the gaps. Rye, barley and oats were common choices for spring sowing, each selected for its ability to thrive in particular soils. Women often followed the sowers, lightly covering the seeds with soil, using rakes or dragging branches behind them. Birds posed a constant threat, so children might be stationed nearby to clap or wave cloths to keep them away. But spring was not only about labour, it was also a season rich with ritual and belief. The success of the sowing was thought to rest as much on divine favour as on human skill. In some villages, priests would bless the fields before planting began, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers for a bountiful harvest. Processions wound their way between the furrows, with villagers singing hymns or chanting in unison. Charms might be buried at the edges of fields, a scrap of bread, a coin, or a sprig of evergreen as tokens of protection. These customs blended Christian rites with older pre-Christian traditions rooted in the cycles of the earth. Caring for the young crops in spring required constant vigilance. Weeds had to be pulled before they could overtake the tender shoots and ditches cleared to keep water flowing properly. In wetter climates, flooding could drown a crop, while in drier regions, early heat could parch it. The medieval farmer relied on observation and intuition, reading the colour of leaves, the feel of the soil and the behaviour of animals to predict what the weather might bring. Without modern tools, this was as close to science as most villages could get, a knowledge passed down through generations and refined by lived experience. Spring also demanded attention to livestock, which were essential partners in farming. Sheep and cattle kept on winter fodder were turned out to graze on fresh grass. Lambing season was a busy and anxious time, with the health of the flock determining the supply of wool milk and meat for the year ahead. Manure from the animals was collected and spread over fields to enrich the soil. In many ways, animals and crops formed a single cycle. The fields fed the beasts and the beasts fed the fields. A failure in one could threaten the other. The social life of the village in spring mirrored the pace of the work, active, hopeful and communal. Families helped each other repair fences, mend tools and prepare seed. Work in the open air fostered constant conversation, news from other villages, tales of past harvests and predictions for the coming one. Evenings might bring gatherings at the alehouse or informal meetings on the green, where plans for shared labour were made. Though the days were long, the sense of shared purpose carried the community forward. Yet for all the optimism of spring, there was always an undercurrent of anxiety. A poor sowing could doom the year before it had truly begun. A late frost, a sudden flood, or an outbreak of disease among the livestock could undo weeks of careful work. This is why the rituals, the blessings, and the prayers held such weight. They were as much about calming human fears as about seeking divine help. In a world where survival depended on forces beyond human control, hope was a necessity, not a luxury. By late spring, the first signs of success or failure began to show. Fields shimmered with green, and the village measured its future in the height and colour of the plants. Weeding and maintenance continued, but the heaviest work shifted toward preparing for summer tasks. The energy of sowing gave way to the steadier pace of tending and waiting. For medieval peasants, this was a time to watch the land closely, to trust in their labour, and to prepare for the demanding months ahead. Spring was a season of beginnings, not guarantees. It asked for faith in the soil, in the weather, in the strength of one's neighbours, and in the mercy of God. Each planted seed carried the weight of the year's hopes, and every green blade was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. For those who lived by the land, spring was not just a chapter in the farming year. It was the prologue to survival itself, And as we step forward into summer, we carry with us both the promise and the uncertainty that spring has sown.
Long days, hard work, summer's gift.
Summer in the medieval countryside was the season of relentless work. The sun rose early and lingered late, stretching the hours of daylight into long, demanding shifts in the fields. For peasants, this was not a time of leisure, but of urgency. The growth and survival of crops depended on constant care. The air was heavy with the scent of ripening grain-cut grass and the smoke of small fires where weeds and chaff were burned. Days began before the heat took hold, but the labour often stretched well into the evening when the low sun painted the sky with gold. Every able body, from the strongest men to nimble-handed children, had a role to play. One of the first major tasks of summer was the hay harvest. Hay was vital for feeding livestock through the winter, and timing was critical. Cut too early, and it lacked nutrition. Cut too late, and it lost its softness and flavour. Men wielded long scythes in broad, sweeping arcs, the metal blades glinting in the sun. Behind them, women and children raked the cut grass into rows, turning it to dry evenly under the warmth. The work was hot and repetitive, but it carried a rhythm that kept the village moving in unison. Once dry, the hay was gathered into stacks or stored in barns protected from rain. Weeding and pest control filled many of the days between larger harvests. Peasants moved methodically down rows of crops, pulling weeds by hand or cutting them with small knives. Birds, insects, and small animals were constant threats to the growing grain, so scarecrows' clappers and children waving cloths were a common sight. In some places, villagers used smoky fires to deter pests, letting the wind carry the haze over the fields. This care was labour-intensive, but without it, much of the harvest could be lost before it ever reached maturity. Summer work was as much about guarding as it was about gathering. Harvesting early crops was another important part of summer labour. Peas, beans, and certain vegetables reached maturity in these months, providing fresh food after the lean weeks of spring. Women often took the lead in gathering these crops, carrying baskets to and from the fields. These early yields were a welcome change from the dried or preserved foods that had dominated the winter diet. Still, much of what was gathered had to be preserved, dried in the sun, salted, or stored in cool pits to ensure supplies would last until the next growing season. Preservation was as critical as production. Summer was also the season of repair and preparation. Tools dulled from constant use had to be sharpened, ploughs and carts mended, and fences reinforced against wandering animals. Villagers took advantage of the long days to build or restore barns, repair thatched roofs, and strengthen storage facilities before the heavier harvests of autumn. Blacksmiths worked steadily to produce nails, hinges, and replacement blades, while carpenters shaped handles for tools. These behind-the-scenes tasks were essential. A broken cart or dull scythe at the wrong time could mean a costly delay in the fields. The heat of summer brought its own challenges. Working under the sun for hours was exhausting, and dehydration was a real danger. Water was fetched from wells or streams and carried to the fields in wooden buckets or leather flasks. Midday meals were often taken in the shade of a tree, or hedgerow bread, cheese and ale eaten quickly before returning to work. Clothing was adapted for the weather-lighter tunic, straw hats, and simple leather shoes or bare feet to keep cool. Even with these measures, the fatigue of summer labour was inescapable. Despite the grind, summer carried moments of beauty and satisfaction. Fields swayed like golden seas in the wind, and the sight of healthy crops standing tall was a reward in itself. In the evenings, the air cooled, and the village hummed with quieter tasks, mending clothes, shelling peas, or telling stories by the hearth. Children played in the lanes, their laughter mingling with the soft sounds of animals settling for the night. These small pleasures balanced the relentless demands of the season, offering brief respite before the next day's work began. Community cooperation was crucial in summer. Tasks like haymaking or large-scale weeding were often done collectively with neighbours, helping one another in exchange for the same support later. These work parties not only sped up the labour, but also reinforced bonds within the village. Jokes, songs, and shared meals turned grueling days into something almost festive. This mutual aid was not optional in a world without machinery. Survival depended on many hands working together. By late summer, the first signs of autumn were in the air. The grain heads grew heavy, bending in the breeze, and the scent of ripeness drifted across the fields. peasants began to sharpen sickles and prepare storage barns, knowing the most critical harvest of the year was just ahead. The pace of life, already swift, quickened further in anticipation. Summer was drawing to a close, but its long days had laid the groundwork for the abundance or scarcity of the months to come. In the medieval farming year, summer was both a test and a triumph. It demanded endurance, skill and cooperation, but it also offered the satisfaction of visible progress. Each bale of hay, each weed pulled, and each basket of vegetables was a step towards surviving the winter ahead. For those who lived by the turning of the seasons, summer was the proof of spring's promise, a time when hard work met the sun's generosity, and the land began to yield what had been so carefully sown. Autumn in the medieval countryside was the season of decision, the moment when the year's labour revealed its success or failure. Fields that had been green in spring and golden in summer now stood heavy with grain, the heads bowing as if in gratitude to the earth. The air was cooler, carrying the scent of ripe fruit, cut straw and wood smoke. This was the busiest time of the year, when every hand in the village was needed from dawn until dusk. The harvest was more than work. It was the turning point that would determine whether the coming winter would be one of comfort or hardship. The main grain harvest began as soon as the crop was ready, for timing was critical. Sickles and scythes cut through the stalks in swift practiced motions, laying them in neat bundles to be tied into sheaves. Women and older children followed behind, gathering the sheaves and stacking them to dry before threshing. Threshing separating the grain from the stalk could be done in the field or in barns using flails to beat the crop. Every step was a race against the weather, for a sudden storm could flatten fields and ruin weeks of labour. The work was exhausting, but the sight of full granaries was worth every aching muscle. While grain was the central focus, autumn brought a wealth of other harvests. Orchards yielded apples and pears, which could be eaten fresh-baked into pies or fermented into cider. Gardens produced onions, leeks and cabbages that would store well through winter. Nuts, berries and wild herbs were gathered from hedgerows and woodland edges, adding variety to the diet. In some regions, grapes were pressed for wine, their juice staining hands and clothes deep purple. Each crop had its own window of readiness, so the village calendar in autumn was packed from start to finish. Preservation was as important as collection. Grain was stored in bins or sacks, sometimes sealed with clay or wax to keep pests out. Root vegetables were buried in earth cellars or covered with straw in pits. Meat from slaughtered animals was salted, smoked or dried, since feeding livestock through the winter was costly. Cider and ale were brewed in large batches, ready to be tapped during the cold months. The work of autumn was a delicate balance between immediate use and careful storage. A misstep in either direction could spell trouble before spring returned. Alongside the hard labour, autumn was also the season of feasts and festivals. Once the main harvest was secured, villages often celebrated with communal meal music and dancing. These gatherings had deep roots, blending Christian thanksgiving with older pagan harvest traditions. Tables were laden with bread from the new grain roasted meats and dishes made from the season's bounty. Feasts were not only a reward for the workers, but a reaffirmation of community bonds, a moment to share joy before the long winter closed in. The merriment was heartfelt, but always tinged with the knowledge that the feast marked the end of the agricultural year. Religious observances played a significant role in these celebrations. The church might hold a special service to bless the harvest, giving thanks for God's provision. Processions carried loaves of bread or sheaves of grain to the altar as offerings. In some places, the first and best of the harvest was set aside as a tithe for the church, symbolizing gratitude and obligation. These rituals reminded the villagers that their prosperity was not only the result of human labour, but also in their belief divine favour. The rhythm of faith and farming was intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Even as the festivities unfolded, preparation for winter pressed on. Wood had to be cut and stacked for the hearth's tools, cleaned and stored, and roofs inspected against snow and rain. Livestock were moved into winter shelters, and weaker animals might be slaughtered to avoid the burden of feeding them. Clothing was repaired or made thicker with added layers of wool. The shortening days and chill in the air were constant reminders that the season of plenty was brief, and the months ahead would test the village's stores. Autumn also brought a sense of closure to the farming year. The cycle of ploughing, sowing, tending and reaping had run its course once more. Villagers could look out over their fields, now bare, stubbled and quiet, and see the results of their collective effort. For some, it was a year of abundance, for others, a year of just enough. Either way, the work was done, and all that remained was to endure the winter and prepare for the next spring. In the medieval mind, the harvest was more than an agricultural event. It was a reminder of the fragile balance between human endeavour and nature's will. Good weather, healthy soil, and timely labour could bring prosperity, but too much rain, too little sun, or a swarm of pests could undo it all. This uncertainty gave the season its intensity, filling it with both celebration and caution. The grain in the barn was a promise, but one that would need to last until the next harvest came. Autumn was the season when the medieval village lived most vividly, working at full strength, rejoicing in shared success and bracing for the cold ahead. It was the reward for months of toil and the safeguard for the future. In those few golden weeks, the air was rich with the smell of cut hay-baked bread and wood smoke, the sound of laughter mixing with the steady rhythm of tools at work. And as the last festival fires burned low, the villagers knew they had closed one chapter and stood ready, or as ready as they could be, for the long dark months to come.
Shaping the land, shaping history.
To understand medieval farming, you have to understand the tools that made it possible. These were not the gleaming factory-made implements of the modern age, but handcrafted practical instruments built from wood iron and the skill of village craftsmen. Each tool had a purpose, and its design was shaped by centuries of trial and error in the fields. In the hands of an experienced farmer, even the simplest device could coax life from the soil. And while the work was hard, the right tool could mean the difference between a meagre harvest and a thriving one. At the heart of medieval agriculture stood the plough. The earliest ploughs were simple ards, light wooden frames with a pointed tip pulled by oxen to scratch shallow furrows in the earth. But in much of medieval Europe, especially the heavier clay soils of the north, the heavy plough became a game-changer. Built with a sturdy wooden frame reinforced by an iron ploughshare, it could cut deep into the soil, turning it over and burying weeds. Its large wheels helped keep it steady, while the mouldboard, a curved wooden or metal blade, flipped the soil neatly to one side. This allowed farmers to open up land that had previously been too dense to cultivate. Making a plough required the combined skills of the carpenter and the blacksmith. The wooden frame and handles were shaped from oak or ash for strength, while the ploughshare was forged in the smithy, hammered to a sharp edge that could slice into packed earth. Farmers took great care to keep the ploughshare in good condition, sharpening it regularly and repairing cracks in the wood. A damaged plough at the wrong time of year could bring disaster, so many villagers kept a spare, or had the means to repair one quickly. The plough was so essential that in some regions it was shared among households, with strict schedules dictating who could use it on which days. Once the soil was broken, other tools came into play. The harrow was used to break up clods of earth and create a finer seedbed for planting. Harrows came in various designs. Some were wooden frames studded with wooden or iron teeth. Others were simple branches dragged across the ground. Their purpose was to smooth the surface cover, scattered seed, and pull out leftover weeds. Lightweight enough to be pulled by a single animal or even by hand, the harrow was a humble but indispensable step between ploughing and sowing. Without it, seeds might be left exposed to birds or unevenly buried, reducing the yield. When it came to cutting crops, the sickle was the tool of choice for centuries. Its short, curved blade allowed for precision, letting the reaper grasp a handful of stalks and slice them cleanly at the base. Made from iron, the sickle's edge was kept sharp with regular honing on a whetstone. For larger areas, scythes with their long sweeping blades were sometimes used, though these required more space and skill. Both tools demanded constant maintenance, as a dull blade slowed the work and damaged the plants. The rhythm of harvesting was often set by the swish of sickles through grain, a sound that marked the climax of the farming year. Maintenance of these tools was a year-round responsibility. After the harvest blades were cleaned of sap and dirt, then oiled to prevent rust. Wooden handles were checked for cracks and replaced if needed, often using timber from the farmer's own land. In many villages, the blacksmith's forge was as important to agriculture as the fields themselves. Here, broken iron was reforged. New blades were made and repairs were done before the next busy season began. For peasants, investing time in tool care was as essential as tending the crops. Both were acts of survival. Not all medieval tools were large or complex. Some were simple hand tools used for a variety of tasks. Hoes with flat iron blades set at an angle to the handle were perfect for weeding and breaking up soil in smaller plots. Wooden rakes gathered hay and straw while pitchforks with wooden or iron tines lifted and spread it. Spades and shovels dug drainage ditches or garden beds, their blades shaped to suit the soil. Even baskets and sacks counted as tools essential for transporting seed-harvested crops and manure. In the medieval mindset, anything that made a job faster or more efficient had value no matter how humble it appeared. Animals themselves were part of the toolset. Oxen and horses were harnessed to ploughs, harrows and carts, their strength multiplying the farmer's effort. Harness design improved over the centuries with padded collars, replacing older throat and girth harnesses, allowing horses to pull heavier loads without injury. Carts built from sturdy timber with iron fittings carried everything from seed to harvested grain. The upkeep of these working animals, feeding, shoeing and sheltering them, was as vital as maintaining the tools they powered. Without healthy beasts, much of the heavy work simply could not be done. Tools also reflected regional differences in soil climate and available materials. In wetter areas, spades and drainage tools were more common, while in dry regions, irrigation systems required buckets, scoops and channels. Local blacksmiths adapted their designs to suit the needs of their neighbours, making each village's toolkit slightly unique. Travellers could often tell where a tool came from by its shape or craftsmanship, much like a signature of the community that made it. These small variations were evidence of the deep connection between land labour and local skill. In the medieval world, tools were more than mere objects, they were extensions of the farmer's own body. Each plough handle, worn smooth by years of gripping each blade marked by countless sharpenings, carried the history of those who used it. They embodied a blend of necessity, ingenuity and care that defined rural life. Without them, the grand cycles of sowing, growing and harvesting would grind to a halt. And though centuries have passed, the essential shapes of many of these tools remain the same, a testament to their enduring design. Medieval farming was never static. Though often imagined as unchanged for centuries, the reality was that medieval peasants and landowners experimented, adapted, and improved their methods over time. These innovations did not happen overnight, nor were they spread evenly across Europe. Some regions adopted new techniques quickly, while others clung to older ways for generations. But when changes did take root, they transformed both productivity and the shape of rural life. At the heart of these advances were improvements in crop rotation, plough design, and land management. One of the most significant breakthroughs was the three-field system of crop rotation. Before its widespread adoption, many communities relied on a two-field system. One field was planted, while the other lay fallow to recover its nutrients. The three-field system divided arable land into three parts, one planted with a winter crop like wheat or rye, another with a spring crop such as barley, oats or legumes, and the third left fallow. This arrangement meant that only 1/3 of the land was unplanted at any given time, increasing total production. Over several years, the cycle rotated so that each section of land had time to rest, while still contributing to the food supply. The advantages of this system were profound. Not only did it boost the amount of food grown, but the inclusion of legumes in the spring planting helped restore nitrogen to the soil, naturally enriching it for future crops. This meant healthier soil, better yields, and a more reliable harvest year after year. Villages that adopted the three-field rotation could support more people, leading to population growth, and in some cases the expansion of settlements. It also diversified the diet, reducing the risk of malnutrition by adding variety to the medieval table. For a society always living close to the edge of scarcity, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Alongside changes in crop rotation came advancements in the plough. The heavy-wheeled plough with its iron ploughshare and mouldboard was perfectly suited to the dense clay-rich soils of northern Europe. While earlier light ards could only scratch the surface, the heavy plough cut deep, turning over large sections of earth and burying weeds. This not only prepared the land more effectively for sowing, but also allowed farmers to cultivate new, previously marginal lands. With iron components, the plough lasted longer and maintained a sharper cutting edge, reducing the need for constant repair. The spread of the heavy plough had wider consequences than just improved fields. Because it required more animal power, typically teams of 8 oxen, farmers began cooperating more closely, pooling animals and sharing equipment. This encouraged stronger communal ties and more organised field systems. In some areas, the need to coordinate plough teams even influenced the layout of villages and the way land was divided into strips. Agricultural efficiency was driving changes not only in farming but in the very social fabric of rural life. Land management innovations went hand in hand with these technological shifts. The open field system, common in much of medieval Europe, arranged farmland in large unfenced fields divided into narrow strips. These strips were allocated to different families, ensuring that each household had a share of good and less productive soil. When combined with three-field rotation, this system allowed the entire community to work in unison, moving through the same planting and harvesting stages together. Such cooperation reduced the risk that pests or disease in one field would spread unchecked as the village's agricultural rhythm was synchronized. Irrigation and drainage techniques also advanced, particularly in wetter or marshy regions. Simple ditches and channels diverted excess water from fields, preventing rot and allowing earlier sowing in spring. In drier climates, water was brought in through small-scale irrigation works, nothing on the scale of ancient Rome's aqueducts, but enough to make a difference in yields. Some monasteries, with their organized labor and resources, became centers for experimenting with these techniques, passing their knowledge to surrounding villages. Over time, these adjustments meant more land could be brought under cultivation, increasing both food and income. Another important development was the use of horses for ploughing and heavy transport. Oxen remained the standard in many areas because of their endurance and lower feed costs, but horses equipped with the improved horse collar could work faster and for longer hours. The padded collar shifted the weight to the horse's shoulders rather than its neck, preventing injury and allowing it to pull heavier loads. This innovation, combined with iron horseshoes for better traction and hoof protection, made horses a valuable complement to oxen in medieval agriculture. Villages with access to horses could complete ploughing and hauling tasks more quickly, freeing up labour for other seasonal work. The cumulative effect of these innovations was a steady rise in agricultural productivity. More food meant healthier populations, greater resistance to famine and surplus crops that could be sold at market. This surplus encouraged trade, leading to the growth of towns and the spread of goods, ideas and technologies. It also allowed some members of rural society to specialize in crafts or services rather than farming, slowly diversifying the medieval economy. While no single invention created this change on its own together, they formed a foundation for Europe's gradual transformation in the High Middle Ages. Yet it's important to remember that these changes did not eliminate risk. Weather, disease and war could still devastate even the best prepared villages. A year of heavy rains could rot grain in the fields, while drought could wither crops despite careful rotation. Innovations improved the odds, but they did not guarantee success. For medieval farmers, every harvest remained a gamble, though one now tilted slightly more in their favour. By the end of the Middle Ages, the combination of better tools, smarter planting cycles, and improved land use had reshaped the European countryside. Villages were larger diets, more varied, and populations more resilient than in earlier centuries. The medieval landscape we imagine, patchwork fields, well-fed flocks, bustling markets, was built on these quiet but powerful changes in farming practice. And while the world has moved far beyond ox-drawn ploughs and open field strips, the principles of rotation, soil care and community cooperation still echo in agriculture today.
Land, labour and power intertwined.
In the medieval countryside, farming was not just about working the land, it was about serving those who owned it. Most peasants did not hold their fields outright, but worked them under the authority of a local lord. This relationship, known as feudal tenure, bound the farmer to both the soil and the obligations that came with it. In return for the right to farm their strips of land, peasants were required to pay rent, either in produce labour or a combination of both. These duties formed the backbone of the rural economy, ensuring that the manor could sustain itself and its ruling household. The rent-in-kind payment through goods rather than coins was the most common form of obligation. At harvest time, peasants were expected to deliver a portion of their grain, vegetables or livestock to the lord's storehouse. This might be measured in sheaves of wheat, barrels of ale, or even a set number of eggs and chickens each year. The amount owed varied depending on the size and quality of the peasant's holding, but it was often enough to be felt keenly. For many families, meeting these quotas meant carefully balancing what they kept for their own survival against what was owed to the manor. In addition to produced peasants owed labour days work directly on the lord's domain, the land set aside for the lord's own use. This work, known as week work or boon work, often fell during the busiest parts of the agricultural year. In spring, peasants might plough and sow the lord's fields. In summer, they could be called to cut hay, and in autumn they would help bring in the harvest. Because these days were fixed by custom or contract, a peasant could be pulled away from tending their own crops at critical times, adding to the challenge of balancing duties to the manor with personal needs. The manor's reeve, often a villager elected or appointed by the community, was responsible for overseeing this labour. Acting as the link between the lord's steward and the peasants, the reeve organised work schedules, ensured that tools and animals were ready, and reported any failures to fulfil obligations. This position was both a mark of trust and a heavy burden. The reeve was answerable to the lord, but lived among the people whose work he directed. Disputes could arise if the reeve was seen as favouring the manor too much, or conversely as neglecting the lord's interests. Not all obligations were predictable. In times of special need, such as building a new barn, repairing a bridge, or preparing for a feast, the lord could call for extra days of work known as boon services. These were often accompanied by some form of reward, such as a meal or small payment, but they still took time and energy away from a peasant's own household. Refusing such summons was rarely an option, and repeated failure to meet obligations could result in fines, loss of land, or even expulsion from the manor. The balance of power was clear. The land might be worked by the peasant, but it belonged to the lord. Beyond labour and produce, there were other dues woven into the fabric of rural life. Mills, ovens, and wine presses on the manor were often the lord's property, and peasants were required to use them for a fee. Grain had to be milled at the lord's mill, with a portion kept as payment. Bread baked in the manor oven came with a charge, and wine or cider pressed on the lord's equipment meant a share of the product went to the lord. These monopolies ensured a steady stream of resources to the manor and reinforced the peasants' dependence on their lord's infrastructure. Yet this system was not purely one-sided exploitation. The lord, in theory, had responsibilities toward his tenants. He was expected to protect the village from outside threats such as bandits or raiding armies, and to maintain the manor's defences. In times of famine or disaster, he might open his granaries to feed the villagers, though this was often done with an eye to maintaining the workforce. The relationship between lord and peasant was a mixture of obligation, protection, and necessity, bound together by the reality that both parties depended on the productivity of the land. The social hierarchy within the manor influenced how obligations were met. Wealthier peasants, sometimes called yeomen or freemen, might hold more land and owe less labour, paying higher rents in produce or coin instead. Poorer tenants, including serfs bound to the land, had fewer freedoms and heavier work obligations. This division could create tensions within the village, as those with more resources had greater ability to weather bad harvests and still meet the lord's demands. For the poorest, a single failed crop could push them into debt or force them to sell their labour cheaply. Seasonal rhythms shaped when and how obligations were fulfilled. The heaviest demands for labour came during spring ploughing, summer haymaking, and autumn harvest, when every hand was needed on the lord's land. Winter obligations often took the form of repairs, transporting goods, or processing stored harvests. Because the manor's needs mirrored the agricultural cycle, peasants sometimes found themselves working on the lord's fields when their own crops needed attention, most a built-in tension that defined medieval rural life. In the end, the system of lords and labour was the economic engine of the medieval countryside. It bound together landowner and labourer in a web of rights and duties that sustained the manor, and by extension the broader feudal order. For the peasant, it was a life of constant negotiation between survival and obligation, personal need and communal duty. For the lord, it was a system that ensured control over both land and the people who worked it. Together they formed the enduring structure of rural life in the Middle Ages, a structure that would last for centuries and leave its imprint on the very landscape of Europe.
Faith and fields, bound in harmony.
In the medieval countryside, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the moral compass, social centre, and even an agricultural partner for the community. The rhythms of the farming year were intertwined with the liturgical calendar, each season marked by feast days, fasts, and religious processions. Priests blessed the fields before planting, prayed for rain during drought, and led thanksgiving masses after the harvest. The church's presence was constant, from the tolling of bells to mark the day's hours to the carved saints, watching over villagers as they worked. Faith and farming were not separate worlds. They were woven together in daily life. Many medieval villages were built around a church both physically and spiritually. Its tower was often the tallest structure for miles, serving as a landmark for travellers and a point of orientation for locals in the fields. The churchyard might hold a small garden for herbs used in medicine or liturgy, tended by the priest or parishioners. Inside murals and stained glass depicted biblical scenes that often drew on rural imagery, helping illiterate villagers see their own lives reflected in sacred stories. For the peasant farmer, the church was a reminder that every furrow ploughed and every seed sown was part of a larger divine order. One of the church's most tangible roles in agriculture was its control over land. Monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches often owned extensive estates, worked by tenants who owed rent and labour, much like they did to secular lords. Monastic farms known as granges were managed with efficiency, sometimes pioneering new techniques in crop rotation, drainage, or animal husbandry. The wealth generated from these lands supported religious activities, funded charitable works, and maintained the buildings themselves. In some regions, the church was the single largest landholder, making it a powerful player in the rural economy. The church also shaped farming through its collection of tithes, a tenth of a peasant's produce owed to support the parish and clergy. This could be paid in grain, livestock, or other goods, and was often stored in tithe barns that still stand in parts of Europe today. While tithes were a religious duty, they were also a significant economic burden, especially in years of poor harvest. Failure to pay could lead to penalties, but for many villagers, the act of giving was as much about spiritual obligation as about material necessity. The tithe symbolized the belief that all abundance came from God, and thus a portion should be returned in gratitude. Religious festivals punctuated the agricultural year, offering both spiritual renewal and much-needed rest from work. Planting season might be preceded by rogation days, when processions wound through the fields chanting prayers for protection and fertility. Harvest was often followed by a feast of thanksgiving such as Lammas in England, where the first loaf baked from the new grain was blessed in church. Saints' days linked to specific crops or weather patterns were observed with particular fervour. St. Medard for rain, St. Isidore the farmer for a good yield. These events blurred the line between sacred ritual and agricultural necessity, reinforcing the bond between faith and the land. Fasting periods also affected farming life. Lent Advent and other times of abstinence changed the village diet, reducing demand for certain foods like meat, and increasing reliance on fish grains and vegetables. This in turn influenced what was planted, harvested, and preserved. On fast days, peasants might work just as hard in the fields, but eat more sparingly, turning meals into a reminder of spiritual discipline. In a way, the church's calendar imposed its own cycle of consumption, alongside the natural cycle of growth. The church's influence extended to the education of farming knowledge, albeit indirectly. Monastic scribes copied agricultural texts, preserving Roman works like those of Columella and translating them into vernacular languages. Monks experimented with vineyards, orchards, and herb gardens, documenting their results in detailed records. These innovations sometimes spread to the surrounding countryside, especially when lay brothers or hired labourers brought the techniques back to their home villages. While not every monastery was a hub of experimentation, the potential for knowledge sharing made the church a bridge between tradition and progress. Spiritual symbolism often coloured how people understood their work in the fields. Biblical parables spoke of sowers' harvests and vineyards making the farmer's labour a metaphor for moral and spiritual truths. The act of tending the land could be seen as a form of devotion mirroring God's care for humanity. Conversely, neglecting one's fields was sometimes framed as a moral failing, inviting divine displeasure as much as agricultural ruin. This moral dimension gave farming an added layer of meaning, reinforcing diligent stewardship and communal responsibility. In times of crisis, the church was both a refuge and a rallying point. Droughts, floods, or pest infestations might prompt special masses, processions, or the display of relics believed to bring divine intervention. Monasteries sometimes opened their granaries to feed the hungry, though not without careful management to preserve their own survival. Priests counselled patience and faith, framing hardship as a test to be endured with piety. Whether or not these acts changed the outcome, they offered the community a sense of unity and hope in the face of uncertainty. By binding the agricultural year to the rhythms of worship, the medieval church ensured that the work of the fields was never just about food. It was about gratitude, obedience, and the belief that human effort was part of a divine plan. From the first furrow in spring to the last sheaf in autumn, the church's bells marked the passage of time, calling farmers to prayer, as surely as the seasons called them to labour. In this way, faith and farming grew side by side, each sustaining the other in the enduring cycle of medieval rural life.
Enduring the storm, season after season.
For medieval peasants, the rhythm of the farming year was always shadowed by the threat of famine and disease. A single bad season could turn abundance into scarcity, and scarcity into disaster. Crops were vulnerable to countless dangers: late frosts, heavy rains, summer droughts, or swarms of pests that could strip a field bare. Because most villages lived harvest to harvest, there were few reserves to cushion a poor yield. In such times, the margin between survival and starvation could be painfully thin, and the entire community felt the strain. The causes of famine were as varied as they were relentless. Weather patterns beyond human control could ruin months of labour in days. Heavy rains could rot grain in the field. Drought could leave it stunted and brittle. A hard winter might kill livestock before spring grass returned, while plant diseases, though not yet understood as such, could devastate wheat or barley. In the medieval mindset, such events were often interpreted as divine punishment, a trial of faith, or the result of collective sin. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same empty granaries and anxious faces. When famine struck, the effects rippled through every layer of society. Food prices in local markets soared, putting even basic staples out of reach for poorer households. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them more vulnerable to illness. Families might be forced to sell possessions, livestock, or even land to afford bread. In desperate cases, people resorted to eating whatever they could find, roots bark or unripe grain that could cause illness. The strain on social bonds was immense as charity became harder to give when everyone was hungry. Disease often followed famine carried on the weakened bodies of the underfed. Malnutrition lowered immunity, creating ideal conditions for outbreaks of illnesses such as dysentery, typhoid, or influenza. Contaminated water, often the result of neglected wells or flooding, spread sickness quickly through a village. Epidemics could strike with terrifying speed, emptying homes and leaving fields untended. Even when the disease was not immediately deadly, it could incapacitate the workforce, compounding the effects of food shortages. Some of the most devastating crises in medieval history came from the deadly combination of famine and disease. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, for example, was triggered by years of heavy rain that ruined crops and drowned livestock. Grain reserves ran out and hunger drove people to eat seed grain meant for planting, ensuring that future harvests would also fail. Disease spread in the weakened population, and chroniclers recorded scenes of entire families perishing in their homes. The memory of these years lingered for generations, a reminder of how quickly stability could collapse. Plague was the most feared disease of all, and while the Black Death of the mid-14th century is the most famous, smaller outbreaks of plague occurred before and after it. Spread by fleas on rats, the disease could kill within days, leaving blackened swellings on the body. Villages struck by plague sometimes saw half their population vanish in a single season. The loss of so many hands could mean fields went unploughed, harvests rotted in place, and survivors faced hunger even after the disease passed. The social order itself was shaken when labour became scarce, and survivors began to demand better terms for their work. Yet famine and disease were not always the result of natural forces alone. Human choices played a role too. Wars could disrupt planting and harvesting, burn fields and scatter communities. Lords might still demand rents and labour, even in bad years, draining the resources of struggling households. Hoarding or speculation in grain could deepen shortages as wealthier merchants and landowners sought profit from scarcity. In such cases, famine became not only a natural disaster but also a man-made one. Communities developed coping strategies to survive these recurring threats. Some villages maintained small emergency stores of grain, though these were often inadequate for prolonged crises. Others relied on reciprocal aid, with neighbours sharing food. in the hope that help would be returned in their own time of need. Monasteries and churches sometimes opened their granaries or distributed bread to the poor, fulfilling their duty of charity. Seasonal migration, leaving home to find work and food elsewhere, was another survival tactic, though it carried its own dangers. Stories from the medieval period capture both the despair and the resilience of those who lived through famine and disease. Chronicles tell of villages where no ploughs moved for an entire year, the fields silent as their people lay ill. Yet they also speak of communities that rebuilt, reseeded, and prayed for better seasons. Folk tales and sermons turned these hardships into moral lessons, urging perseverance, faith, and mutual aid. Even in the face of overwhelming loss, the medieval peasant's instinct was to adapt, endure, and return to the cycle of the land. For the people of the Middle Ages, famine and disease were not distant possibilities. They were familiar adversaries woven into the fabric of life. Every spring, planting was a gamble against these forces, every harvest a moment of both relief and caution. Survival depended on a mix of hard work, communal support, and a measure of luck. And while the tools, techniques, and protections we have today would be unimaginable to them, their struggles remain a testament to human resilience in the face of nature's hardest tests.
Together, they preserved life and hope.
Survival in the medieval countryside depended as much on skill and foresight as it did on the fertility of the soil. Generations of peasants passed down hard-earned knowledge on how to prepare for lean years, knowing that hardship was not a matter of if, but when. These strategies were born from centuries of trial and error refined in the face of unpredictable weather crop failures and disease. A well-prepared household could make the difference between a community that endured and one that withered. In a world without modern safety nets, survival was a craft in itself. One of the most fundamental strategies was the careful preservation of food. Grain, the staple of the medieval diet, was stored in wooden bins, clay jars, or woven baskets, lined with pitch or resin to keep out moisture and pests. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and carrots were buried in pits insulated with straw, allowing them to keep through the winter months. Meat was salted, smoked over open fires, or dried into strips that could last for months if kept dry. These preservation methods required planning well in advance. A family had to think in terms of seasons, not days when managing their stores. Diversification of crops was another key to survival. Relying on a single type of grain was risky. If blight or bad weather struck, the entire year's food supply could vanish. By planting a mix of wheat, rye, barley, oats, and legumes, peasants spread the risk across different harvest times and growing conditions. Legumes in particular enriched the soil with nitrogen, improving yields for the next year. Small kitchen gardens near the home grew vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants, adding both variety and resilience to the household diet. The more diverse the food sources, the harder it was for a single disaster to ruin them all. Livestock management played an equally important role. Chickens, goats, sheep, and pigs provided meat, milk, eggs, and wool, while also serving as a form of movable wealth. In hard times, animals could be sold or slaughtered to provide food and income. Manure from livestock was used to fertilize fields, creating a sustainable cycle between animals and crops. Careful breeding and culling ensured that herds and flocks remained healthy and productive. For many peasants, a well-kept pig or a milk-producing goat could mean survival through a harsh winter. Water sources were protected and maintained with care, as clean water was essential for both people and animals. Wells were kept clear of debris and streams were monitored for signs of contamination. In some villages, water rights were shared and managed collectively to ensure fair access during dry spells. Simple filtration methods like letting water settle in clay pots before use reduced the risk of disease. Protecting water was not just about health, it was about ensuring the ability to cook brew ale and maintain basic sanitation year-round. Communal support networks were perhaps the most powerful survival tool of all. Villagers shared tools, labour, and sometimes even food in times of need. During planting or harvest, neighbours worked side by side to ensure that everyone's crops were tended before bad weather struck. In famine years, better-off households might lend grain to others, with the understanding it would be repaid after the next harvest. This system of mutual aid was built on trust, reinforced by the knowledge that next time the roles could be reversed. Isolation was dangerous. Community was security. Knowledge was passed down through stories, proverbs, and hands-on teaching. children learned to recognize the signs of approaching storms, the best times to plant certain crops, and how to store food properly. Skills like mending clothing, making rope, or repairing tools were taught early, ensuring self-sufficiency. Herbal remedies for common illnesses were part of this inherited wisdom, offering relief when formal medical care was unavailable or too costly. In this way, survival strategies were not only practical but also cultural, binding generations together through shared experience. Seasonal festivals and religious observances also played a subtle role in survival. Feast days often coincided with natural breaks in the agricultural cycle, giving the community time to rest, repair equipment, and take stock of supplies. Church blessings over fields or animals were as much about fostering hope and unity as they were about seeking divine favour. By reinforcing social bonds, these traditions strengthened the networks that people relied on in emergencies. Morale, though intangible, was a crucial resource in hard times. Adaptation to changing conditions was another hallmark of survival. Villages sometimes shifted the location of fields, adopted new crops, brought by trade, or altered planting schedules to respond to climate changes. Innovations such as the heavy plough or improved harnesses were adopted when possible, increasing productivity and reducing labour demands. Even small changes like planting hedgerows for windbreaks or experimenting with crop spacing could yield big benefits over time. Flexibility kept communities from being trapped by old methods when new ones offered better results. Ultimately, survival in the medieval countryside was not about defeating nature but about working with it. Peasants accepted that bad years would come, but they prepared for them with foresight, skill, and cooperation. Each household's resilience was strengthened by the resilience of its neighbours, creating a web of interdependence that could withstand many blows. In this way, hardship did not just test the community, it shaped it, teaching lessons that would be handed down for generations. The strategies they developed remain echoes in modern rural life, reminders that preparation and unity are timeless shields against uncertainty.
Myths fade. Real lives endure.
The life of a medieval peasant has long been wrapped in myth. Popular culture often paints them as eternally downtrodden, living in filth, ignorance, and misery, chained to their lord's fields with no hope of change. While hardship was real and unavoidable, this image oversimplifies a far more complex reality. Peasants were not just passive victims of the system. They were active participants in shaping their communities and managing their resources. To understand them fully, we have to separate romanticized myths and exaggerated stereotypes from the truths recorded in chronicles, archaeological finds, and the lived experiences passed down through generations. One common myth is that peasants were little more than slaves. While serfdom did bind many to the land, it was not identical to slavery. Serfs could not be bought and sold as individuals apart from their land, and they had legal rights, however limited. They could marry, raise families, own personal property, and in some cases earn or negotiate their freedom. Free peasants who owed rent or service but were not bound by law to the manor made up a significant portion of the rural population in some regions. The feudal bond was restrictive, but it also carried mutual obligations. The lord owed protection in return for labour and dues. Another misconception is that peasants worked constantly from dawn to dusk every day of the year. In truth, their work was highly seasonal, with periods of intense labour during planting and harvest, balanced by slower winter months. Religious feast days, often numbering over 100 in the year, offered breaks from daily toil. While the labour was physically demanding and time-consuming, medieval people understood the need for rest, especially in the colder seasons when daylight was short. Leisure was woven into their lives through festivals, communal gatherings, and storytelling. The image of the endlessly toiling peasant ignores these natural ebbs and flows. Hygiene is another area where legend has outstripped reality. The stereotype of the unwashed medieval peasant ignores evidence of regular washing, grooming, and clothing care. Streams, rivers, and village wells provided water not only for drinking, but for cleaning bodies and clothes. Linen undergarments which absorbed sweat and oils were changed and washed more often than outer garments. Bathing in wooden tubs, often in heated water, was not unheard of, though it was more of an occasional luxury than a daily habit. Cleanliness mattered both for comfort and for health, even if it did not match modern standards. Diet is also subject to misunderstanding. While it's true that meat was less common for peasants than for the nobility, their diet was not as meagre as often imagined. Bread pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables, cheese, eggs and ale, formed the staples supplemented by seasonal vegetables, fruits and occasionally fish or meat. Hunting rights were restricted, but peasants could trap small game or fish in local streams. In good years, meals could be hearty and varied. In bad years, they were simple, but still provided necessary calories. Malnutrition was a risk, but not the constant state some depictions suggest. Another legend suggests that peasants were ignorant of the world beyond their village. While most did not travel far, news goods and ideas reached even remote communities through traders, pilgrims, and seasonal labourers. Market days in nearby towns brought exposure to foreign spices, cloth, and stories from distant lands. Religious festivals often drew people from multiple villages together, creating opportunities for exchange. Oral tradition songs, folk tales, and proverbs carried not only entertainment, but also moral lessons, history, and practical knowledge. Peasants may not have been literate, but they were not cut off from the flow of information. The notion that peasants had no influence over their own lives also requires correction. Village communities often exercised a surprising degree of self-governance through manor courts, parish meetings, and informal agreements. Disputes over land boundaries, resource use, and local obligations were frequently resolved by the villagers themselves, with the Lord Steward present mainly to formalise the outcome. Peasants organised collective labour for major tasks, shared resources like plough teams, and decided how to allocate common pasture or woodland. This communal decision-making gave them a voice even within the rigid framework of feudalism. There's also the belief that medieval peasants lived only for survival with no sense of beauty or artistry in their lives. In reality, creativity flourished in even the humblest homes. Embroidered clothing, carved wooden utensils, and decorated pottery were common. Songs and dances marked both work and leisure, while storytelling was an art form passed from elders to children. Seasonal festivals featured garlands, painted banners, and music bringing colour and joy into the agricultural year. Beauty was not the preserve of castles and cathedrals, it was part of village life. The idea that peasants were universally oppressed ignores the variety of their circumstances. Geography, local climate, soil quality, and the character of the local lord all shaped daily life. A peasant in fertile northern France with a fair-minded lord might live more comfortably than one in a drought-prone corner of Spain under a harsh landlord. The line between prosperity and hardship was thin, but not every village was on the brink of collapse. Some communities grew wealthy enough through surplus production to improve their homes, invest in better tools, or trade for luxuries. It's also worth noting that peasants were not static across centuries. The Middle Ages spanned a vast stretch of time during which farming methods, social structures, and political realities changed. The agricultural innovations of the High Middle Ages increased yields and altered land use. Events like the Black Death shifted the balance of power as labour shortages allowed surviving peasants to demand better terms. To speak of the medieval peasant as a single unchanging figure is to overlook the dynamic nature of rural society. Even the relationship between peasants and the church is often simplified. While the church collected tithes and enforced moral discipline, it also provided education, charity, and a sense of community. Monasteries offered employment shelter, and sometimes food in times of scarcity. Religious festivals were eagerly anticipated breaks from work, blending faith with festivity. Peasants could be devout skeptical, or somewhere in between. Their relationship with the church was as complex as any modern believers. Some modern depictions romanticize peasants as living in perfect harmony with nature, free from the corruption of cities. While they did work closely with the land, it was not an idyllic partnership. Nature could be generous or merciless, and peasants had to adapt to its moods. Clearing forests, draining marshes, and fencing pastures altered the environment just as industrial agriculture does today on a larger scale. The connection to the land was deep, but it was shaped by necessity as much as by reverence. Legends also downplay the resilience and adaptability of peasants. They were not merely enduring their world, they were actively shaping it within the limits they faced. They experimented with new crops, adjusted planting schedules to changing weather, and learned from neighbouring regions. They rebuilt after fires, replanted after floods, and replanned after losing land to war. This resilience was not glamorous, but it was the foundation on which medieval rural life rested. In separating myth from reality, we find that peasants were neither the miserable wretches of some accounts, nor the carefree children of nature in others. They were people complex, resourceful, bound by their circumstances, but not entirely defined by them. Their lives were a blend of hardship and joy, tradition, and adaptation, dependence, and self-reliance. To understand them is to see beyond the clichés and into the lived experience of the majority of medieval Europeans. Ultimately, the legends we tell about peasants say as much about us as they do about them. Romanticizing or vilifying their lives often reflects our own views on work, freedom, and the past. But by looking closely at the evidence, we can appreciate the reality, a life of constant negotiation with the land, the seasons, the community, and the powers above. This reality is richer, more varied, and far more human than any simple myth. And in that humanity lies the true legacy of the medieval peasant, not a symbol of misery or perfection, but a testament to endurance in a world where survival was a shared art.
From Earth's toil to timeless legacy.
As we leave the furrows and fields of the medieval countryside behind, it's clear that peasants were far more than background figures in the story of the Middle Ages. They were the foundation, the ones who made it possible for castles to rise, armies to march, and markets to bustle. Every loaf of bread, every mug of ale, every bolt of cloth began with their labour. Without them, the economy would have collapsed, the nobility would have been powerless, and the church's great buildings might never have been built. Their role was not glamorous, but it was indispensable. The influence of the medieval peasants stretched far beyond the boundaries of the village. The surplus they produced fueled trade, enabling towns to grow and merchants to thrive. Their taxes and rents filled the coffers of lords and kings, funding wars and infrastructure alike. Even political stability often rested on their shoulders. When harvests failed, unrest spread quickly, reminding rulers just how dependent their realms were on rural productivity. In many ways, the medieval peasant was both the engine and the heartbeat of the age. Culturally, too, their impact was lasting. The rhythms of the farming year shaped the festival's music and stories that defined medieval life. Folklore passed from field to hearth carried values of perseverance, cooperation, and respect for the land. Agricultural techniques developed in these centuries, from crop rotation to improved plough designs, laid the groundwork for later advances in farming. Much of what we think of as medieval culture has its roots in the village green and the open field. Politically, peasants were not entirely powerless even under the heavy weight of feudal obligations. In times of crisis, they could and did organise demanding fairer treatment or relief from crushing dues. Rebellions like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 showed that rural labourers could influence the course of history, even if the immediate results were mixed. These moments remind us that political agency often starts far from the halls of power, sometimes in a thatched cottage, sometimes in a muddy field. Looking back, the story of the medieval peasant is a story of adaptation. They adjusted to climate shifts, adopted new tools, and learned to make the most of their resources. They balanced obligations to lords and churches with the needs of their families and communities. This adaptability was not only a survival skill, it was the quiet innovation that kept medieval society functioning through war, famine, and plague. Without it, the Middle Ages might have been far shorter or far more chaotic. Today, as we consider the legacy of this era, it's worth asking what lessons their lives still hold for us. Their connection to the land, their reliance on cooperation, and their ability to endure hardship without losing their sense of community all have relevance in a modern world facing its own challenges. History often remembers kings and knights, but the real continuity of human life is maintained by those who work, adapt, and pass their skills on to the next generation. In that sense, the medieval peasant story is as contemporary as it is ancient. And so after this journey through the seasons, the tools, the hardships, and the triumphs of medieval farming, I'll leave you with a question. What do you think was the single most important tool of the Middle Ages? Was it the heavy plough that opened new lands, the sickle that brought in the grain, or perhaps the knowledge passed from parent to child that no tool could ever replace? Your answer might say as much about your view of history as it does about the past itself. Thank you for walking these fields with me, for listening to the voices of those who left no castles, no grand monuments, but whose work still echoes in the landscapes of Europe today. I hope this journey has brought the medieval countryside to life in your mind, the sounds, the smells, the human stories woven into every furrow. Until our next exploration, take a moment to imagine the weight of a plough handle in your hands, the feel of the soil beneath your boots, and the knowledge that history is often sown in the quietest places. I'll see you in the next chapter of the past.